The Surge, written and read by Christopher Holton. Working as I do as a consultant engineer, I am often called upon at short notice to drive to businesses across the country to resolve engineering problems for various industrial processes. Such was my reputation as a Mr. Fix-It, and I often received desperate calls at varying times to assist companies struggling with industrial machining issues. Such was the case on a bitterly cold New Year's Eve when I was requested at short notice to drive to Aldborough in Suffolk from my home in Cambridgeshire to resolve some teething problems at a recently built brewery some distance from the town. As the issues had shut down production, the company were more than willing to pay me a very generous fee to facilitate my urgent attendance. Having discussed this by telephone with the company director, I agreed to attend immediately. Despite the relatively remote location of the premises, the late hours of the day, and the deteriorating weather. It was a murderous night driving through a heavy thunderstorm along what was no more than compacted stone trackways, which were sometimes heavily flooded and almost impassable. As I drew closer to my destination, I found myself lost and driving along a coastal road near Aldborough. The downpour of water from the storm and the breaking waves flooding across the sea wall provided an almost impenetrable barrier for my headlamps, which barely gave me enough illumination to remain on the road safely. My wipers struggled vainly to improve the view. I was desperate to find somewhere to stop over for the night, and by divine intervention I saw in the far distance through the gloom of darkness a single flickering light coming from a building on the seaward side of the road. As I drove closer, I saw displayed on the side of the road a somewhat dishevelled pub-style sign swinging frantically in the wind and sea spray, which was barely picked out by the headlamp's weakening light. Its faded facade depicted 3 jolly seamen and read "The Three Mariners Inn," and displayed below was a painted and pointed arrow which indicated itself towards a large old building that stood adjunct to a shingle bank by the sea and stood behind in the shadow of a rather squat-looking old Martello tower, which silhouetted like a giant headstone against the lightning flashes of a wild, stormy seascape. As it was very late, I decided to seek shelter for the night at the inn, as, after all, my options of reaching my intended destination that night remained very limited and suicidal. I quickly locked the car near the Martello tower and ran around the building to enter the inn through a heavy timber-framed doorway, which, from memory, was of some great antiquity. The crashing of the waves from the seaward side silenced the activities within, which revealed upon entering a small bar full of fisher-type men chatting to the sound of an accordionist playing a sea shanty. An unusual crowd sat at oak tables smoking clay and wooden pipes and quaffing beer from metal and ceramic tankards as they discussed and argued the worsening weather among themselves. Other than the serving barmaid, there were no other women, and many patrons were dressed in rather old-fashioned attire that would befit an earlier century, with some wearing retro-oiled sou'wester storm jackets, whilst others wore navy-coloured heavy woolen reefer jackets and an array of collarless shirts covered at the neck with scarves. Most were bearded and had suffered the effects of a challenging outdoor life, which was etched on their gaunt faces. As I was in a relatively obscure backwater, I assumed that the modern world of 1938 had yet to reach this forsaken part of Suffolk. But regardless, a stout gentleman brandishing a heavy handlebar moustache across a very stubbly and unkempt puffy face said in a heavy Suffolk brogue, "How can I help you, sir, on a night like tonight?" I replied, "I am trying to get to a nearby brewery, but the road and the weather have somehow led me here. Would it be possible to pay for a room overnight? And also, could I borrow your telephone as I need to call a client?" He smiled. "I'm afraid you are at a dead end here, sir. The road runs out into the sea and we have no telephones you speak of, but we have a spare room, including breakfast, which will cost 1 shilling. Realizing how cheap this was, I gratefully accepted, and the landlord added, "Breakfast is at 8 a.m, sir, and I would advise you to leave when you can in the morning, as I cannot guarantee your safety in weather like this." He cleared his throat and continued, We were hit badly by flooding in 1895 through conditions like this. I realise how bad it is outside, but I suggest you try to return to the town if you can." I thanked him for his concerns, but replied, if I felt safe and competent to drive in these conditions, I would. But I am thankful to you for offering shelter. "Very well, sir. Do you have any luggage?" I raised my right hand and said, "Just a small overnight bag," which I held, and I informed him that I wasn't expecting to be away longer than a night. Calling over to the barmaid, he said, "Sarah will take you up to your room, sir, and feel free to order any food or drink from the bar if you don't fancy coming downstairs." The barmaid Sarah, a blonde-haired country woman in her early 20s wearing a pink dress with a narrow white apron, said, "OK, please follow me through the bar hatch, sir, and I'll take you up to your room." After climbing a very narrow wooden staircase to the upper floor, Sarah led me to a wooden door along a creaky corridor, which she opened and allowed me to enter. As I passed, she said, "I would seriously consider leaving this place tonight if you can. I cannot say anything further, but would advise you to consider my words." I thanked her for her warning, as I believed she was worried about the storm, like the landlord. However, I requested she return in 20 minutes to take my order. She smiled and closed the door as I heard her feet shuffling along the corridor and down the stairs. The room was small but well appointed, with a water-filled jug on a marble washstand, a clean white towel, and a single metal frame brass bed. The toilet was a mahogany commode which, in the 20th century, struck me as an odd sight. But I was far from complaining, as I had warmth from a coal fire, and a beautiful brass and glass-shaded oil lamp illuminated the room. There appeared to be little modern convenience or even an acknowledgement of the 20th century. Still, considering I wasn't outside in that worsening storm, I felt very pleased with my situation. But that was not to last. As agreed, Sarah arrived later, and she returned to my room with a jug of beer, a glass, and a plate of beef sandwiches, which I readily consumed. I have never felt so thirsty, and the beer did not quake that thirst, nor did the water in the jug, and the sandwiches, well, tasted odd. Within minutes I was exhausted. I assumed the journey had drained me, but I found myself unable to move, and shortly afterwards I passed out. When I awoke, I wasn't sure how long I had been asleep, but I was in complete darkness, and struck a match from my pocket, which revealed a locked cellar with a stout wooden door. There was a window which was strengthened and protected by iron bars. In short, I was imprisoned, surrounded by beer kegs. I could hear above me the sound of the revellers I saw earlier, so I knew I was still in that inn. But why was I in the cellar? I furiously kicked the door and shouted for attention, but nobody came. I found an oil lamp which I lit, and in the flickering light I saw what I imagined were spectral forms hiding in the shadows. I called at them, but of course I saw and heard nothing, and they seemingly went away into nothingness. I was struggling to cope with the realization of my situation, which was quite bizarre. The storm outside grew much louder from where I was trapped, and now I could hear waves crashing against the walls, with water starting to pour into the cellar, firstly as a trickle but gradually as a deluge, forming pools around my feet. By now I was starting to panic as the realization of my predicament took hold of me. I climbed up onto a large stack of wooden kegs which, unlike others, were starting to float, and being but a few feet from the wooden ceiling, I was panicking that I was going to drown. Just then a bar slid on the cellar door, which creaked open, and through which some silhouetted figures stepped down into the water and dissolved into a heavy mist which enveloped the cellar and stripped away light into nothingness. At that point I started choking as though the mist was strangling me. I thought I had died as I finally lost consciousness when all felt still and dead. Some hours later I awoke and discovered I was wearing pyjamas and was lying in a hospital bed. I saw by my bed the friendly face of a nurse rubbing my arm gently. "Oh, you're awake now. The doctor said you would awaken soon, and—" I panicked and interjected, "Am I okay, nurse? Why am I here?" She smiled and said, You were found by police earlier this morning lying unconscious on a shingle beach near the Martello Tower. You were fortunate you weren't swept out to sea and drowned. You are now in the local hospital resting, and the doctor will reattend to you later, although you will likely be released sometime today." She then said in a more formal voice, "There is a policeman outside who wishes to speak to you regarding some matters you were saying in delirium when found. Is that okay with you? I have been assured that you aren't in any trouble." Not knowing what I was alleged to have said, I welcomed the nurse to bring him in. Shortly afterwards, the nurse returned with a rather rotund constable with a round ruddy face and neat military moustache. He looked in his mid-30s and strutted into my room, proudly carrying a police helmet under his arm. He gave the helmet to the nurse, who placed it nearby on a table, while I invited him to sit on a chair beside my bed. Having sat down, he said in a rather provincial accent, "Hello, sir. I'm PC Jacobs, and my sergeant sent me over to see how you are. I can say you were fortunate to be found alive. The North Sea can be cruel and unforgiving at the best of times, yet you were lying in a delirious state, mumbling about murder." He cleared his throat and continued, "Could you be kind enough to tell me how you ended up there during the worst storm for at least 43 years? And do you recall seeing a murder?" I laughed nervously and replied, "I became lost last night, officer, and accidentally ended up on that road to the Martello. I didn't know where I was and must have left the car to seek help. I don't remember anything else, but I do recall, I think, seeing a pub there, the Three Mariners Inn." He replied inquisitively, "A pub? Are you sure, sir, really sure?" "I can assure you, officer, that it was there, and the bar was packed with fishermen. Go and ask locally. I'm sure someone recalls me. I remember going inside and taking a room because of the storm." He looked visibly shocked and continued, "You couldn't have been in that pub, because the sea claimed it in 1913 or thereabouts. Well, officer, I was found on the beach having been there during a terrible and freezing storm, and yet I am perfectly well. How can that be?" I recalled further details and reported the feeling of strangulation in the cellar. He looked perfectly aghast and visibly sweaty as he spoke. "There were rumours that the inn was used to murder foreign travellers who landed at its now-gone port by slipping arsenic in their food and drink when they stayed as guests, waiting for the weekly stagecoach. I've been told that that would be around the early 19th century. The inn had only one room, and apparently a secret trapdoor dropped the bodies into the cellar. Once gone, their possessions and valuables were shared among the villagers there. And of course, no trace of the bodies as they were weighted and dumped out at sea." He continued, "Legend says they thought they had poisoned and killed a foreigner who came around in the cellar. They then strangled him as he cursed them in Dutch. Of course, nobody has ever said what the curse was, as none could speak the language. Sir, I cannot explain to you what you know about the pub. I'm guessing you must have known deep down from conscious memory, and you confused reality with what might be today just an old wives' tale, as there is no evidence to support any of this. The doctor attending you thought you might have originally come from the sea, as you had drunk a considerable amount of seawater. Anyway, there is nothing more I can do here except to say we brought your car back from the Martello Tower to help get you on your way again when released. We think everything is present, but please let us know if that isn't the case." Arising to his feet, he gently bowed his head and wished me a safe journey before leaving. After receiving the all-clear from a local doctor who attended to me, I was released, and my now dry clothes were returned. After having made a call to the brewery, I left. But first I had to return to where I had arrived the previous night. I could not believe that I had spent the night in a ghostly building that no longer existed and survived. I drove past the old mill along a narrow road spit leading to the Martello Tower. Having arrived at the building, I parked my car and walked to where I recalled seeing the pub. Sure enough, there was only shingle, but poking from the stones was a shard of crudely broken porcelain from a bottle which bore the words, "The Three Mariners Inn." As I held it, my hands trembled violently as the horrific experience was recalled. I took this souvenir from the beach and later posted it to a local museum. I never returned to Aldborough or the remains of Old Slaughton again. Despite my unforeseen delay in attending the brewery, I got production rolling for them again. Even to this day, I count my blessings for having escaped from there, as the thought of being trapped soullessly forever in such an evil place leaves me with chills to this very day. The end.